Dreaming of exotic destinations and far-flung adventures? For American travelers, the world is vast, but not all countries roll out the welcome mat. In 2024, certain places remain off-limits or downright hostile to U.S. citizens, where entry could lead to more danger than discovery. From the shadows of political conflict to regions gripped by violence, these countries make it clear that Americans aren't wanted. Before packing your bags, take a journey with us through the 10 countries where Americans are not welcome in 2024. Some of these may shock you. Number 10. North Korea. Despite the fascination many people have with North Korea's mysterious regime, it is one of the most restricted countries for Americans in 2024. Since 2017, the U.S. government has implemented a travel ban that prevents citizens from visiting the country, citing national security and the risk of arbitrary detention. This travel restriction was heightened after the tragic death of Otto Warmbier, a U.S. student who was detained in North Korea and returned to the U.S. in a coma. Beyond the political tension, North Korea's lack of diplomatic ties with the U.S. makes it difficult to seek assistance if something goes wrong. Even if you could secure special permission to visit through humanitarian efforts or media, you would be under strict government surveillance. Your every movement would be monitored by a government-appointed guide, and any perceived infraction could lead to imprisonment. In 2024, North Korea remains one of the most dangerous and unwelcoming places for Americans, with very little chance of change on the horizon. Number 9. Iran. Iran has a long and complex history with the United States, and in 2024, the relationship remains severely strained. For American travelers, obtaining a visa for Iran is extremely difficult due to security concerns and political tension between the two nations. Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution, diplomatic relations were severed, and the U.S. imposed economic sanctions that have only worsened over time. In 2024, Americans traveling to Iran face heightened scrutiny and may be subject to detention or harassment. The Iranian government often accuses foreign nationals, particularly Americans, of espionage or plotting against the regime. While Iran boasts stunning historical sites like Persepolis and beautiful landscapes, U.S. tourists are rare, as many opt to avoid the legal risks involved. Additionally, Iran's internal conflicts, such as protests and government crackdowns, make the environment volatile. A reported 83% of Iranians view the U.S. negatively, making it clear that American travelers are unwelcome, not just by the government, but also by a significant portion of the population. With Iran's nuclear program at the center of international controversy, the hostile atmosphere is likely to persist. Number 8. Syria. Syria has long been off-limits for American tourists due to its devastating civil war, which has raged since 2011. The country is in ruins, and the conflict has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands while displacing millions. In 2024, Syria remains one of the most dangerous countries for Americans to visit, with extremist groups such as ISIS and al-Qaeda factions still active in certain regions. Kidnapping, bombings, and targeted attacks on foreigners are all very real threats, and the U.S. State Department has a do-not-travel advisory in place for Syria. U.S. citizens caught in Syria often have little to no protection, as the U.S. Embassy has been closed since 2012. The civil war has turned large parts of the country into war zones, making travel virtually impossible. Moreover, any American seen in Syria might be viewed as a potential enemy, given U.S. involvement in the conflict through airstrikes and other military actions. Despite Syria's ancient history and cultural significance, its current state makes it one of the most unwelcoming places for Americans. Number 7. Venezuela. Venezuela, once a top South American destination for travelers, has drastically shifted its stance toward Americans. Relations between the U.S. and Venezuela have been tense for years, largely due to U.S. sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan government in response to human rights abuses and political instability under Nicolás Maduro. As a result, Venezuela has become increasingly hostile to American visitors, with visa processes often delayed or denied altogether. In addition to strained political ties, Venezuela is grappling with hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages, and rampant crime, making it a dangerous environment for tourists. Caracas, the capital city, has one of the highest crime rates in the world, and kidnappings of foreigners, including Americans, have been reported. The U.S. government has also warned against traveling to Venezuela, citing risks like civil unrest and arbitrary detentions. Even if you're an adventurous traveler, visiting Venezuela in 2024 is not only challenging but also potentially life-threatening, making it one of the least welcoming countries for U.S. citizens. Number 6. Yemen. Yemen has been entrenched in civil war since 2014, and the situation has only worsened. For Americans, Yemen is among the most dangerous and unwelcoming countries, as terrorism, armed conflict, and humanitarian crises dominate the nation. In 2024, U.S. citizens face serious threats if they attempt to travel to Yemen, including the risk of kidnapping, bombings, and militant attacks. In fact, the U.S. State Department has a Level 4 Do Not Travel warning in place, advising against any visits to the country. The ongoing conflict between the Yemeni government and Houthi rebels has torn the country apart. The U.S. Embassy in Yemen suspended operations in 2015, leaving Americans without consular assistance. Yemen has also become a stronghold for extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, which specifically targets Westerners, making it incredibly dangerous for Americans. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen, described as one of the worst in the world, leaves the population in dire conditions, and the country is effectively closed off to U.S. citizens, both for safety and diplomatic reasons. Number 5. Afghanistan. Following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, the Taliban swiftly regained control of the country, and by 2024, Afghanistan remains one of the most unwelcoming places for Americans. The relationship between the U.S. and Afghanistan has always been complicated, but the 20-year military presence and subsequent departure left deep scars. While the Taliban government has promised peace, the reality is that the situation on the ground remains volatile. There are ongoing threats of terrorism from extremist groups like ISIS-K, which specifically target Westerners, especially Americans. Travel to Afghanistan is highly discouraged by the U.S. State Department, with a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory. In addition to safety risks, Americans are often viewed with suspicion, and there's a high potential for kidnapping, arbitrary detention, and violence. Despite Afghanistan's rich cultural heritage and stunning landscapes, including the famous Bamiyan Buddhas and the Panjshir Valley, the security risks are overwhelming. With minimal diplomatic representation from the U.S., getting consular help in Afghanistan is nearly impossible. In 2024, the political, social, and security landscape makes Afghanistan extremely dangerous and inhospitable for Americans. Number 4. Russia. Due to escalating tensions between Russia and the U.S., particularly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the country has become highly unwelcoming for Americans. Diplomatic relations have deteriorated, and in 2024, Americans face significant restrictions when traveling to Russia. The U.S. government has advised citizens to avoid traveling to Russia due to risks of arbitrary enforcement of local laws, harassment, and possible wrongful detentions, as seen in the high-profile cases of detained Americans like Brittany Greener. The Russian government views American travelers with suspicion, and those who do visit often face strict surveillance and restricted movement. In addition, Russia has implemented counter-sanctions against the U.S., further complicating travel logistics. Given the ongoing war in Ukraine and anti-American sentiment in Russia, visiting as a U.S. citizen in 2024 is fraught with tension. Many Russians, influenced by state-controlled media, harbor negative views of the U.S., with polls suggesting that nearly 80% of Russians hold unfavorable opinions of America. From geopolitical conflicts to the possibility of wrongful imprisonment, Russia remains a highly unsafe and unwelcome destination for Americans. Number 3. Cuba. While Cuba is geographically close to the U.S., the political relationship between the two nations remains fraught. Despite the Obama-era efforts to normalize relations, the Trump administration reinstated strict sanctions, and these have largely persisted into 2024. American travelers to Cuba are subject to numerous restrictions, including which hotels they can stay in, which restaurants they can eat at, and what areas they are allowed to visit. Cuba's government also tightly controls tourism, and American visitors are often viewed as pawns in a larger geopolitical game. The economic embargo imposed by the U.S. has fueled anti-American sentiment, with Cubans struggling under shortages of food, medicine, and essential supplies. Although Cuba's beautiful beaches and historic cities, like Havana and Santiago, make it an attractive destination, U.S. tourists face challenges at every step. With strained political ties and complicated visa processes, Americans often find themselves at a disadvantage when visiting Cuba, making it a less than welcoming place in 2024. Number 2. Libya. Libya has been in a state of chaos since the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, and the country remains one of the most dangerous places in the world for American travelers. In 2024, Libya is still engulfed in conflict, with rival militias and terrorist groups controlling large parts of the country. The U.S. State Department has issued a do not travel advisory for Libya due to the risk of kidnapping, armed conflict, and terrorism. Americans are often targets for violence, given the history of U.S. military intervention in Libya. Diplomatic relations between Libya and the U.S. are minimal, with the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli closed for years. Without a stable government or reliable law enforcement, Americans who visit Libya are extremely vulnerable. The Libyan people themselves are caught in the middle of this ongoing conflict, with shortages of food, electricity, and basic healthcare making everyday life a struggle. Even though Libya has stunning natural beauty, including the Sahara Desert and ancient Roman ruins, it remains one of the most hostile places for U.S. travelers in 2024, with very little likelihood of change in the near future. Number 1. Somalia. Somalia tops the list as the most dangerous and unwelcoming country for Americans in 2024. Since the collapse of its government in 1991, Somalia has been plagued by civil war, terrorism, and piracy, making it a no-go zone for most Western travelers. Al-Shabaab, an Islamist militant group linked to Al-Qaeda, controls significant parts of the country and frequently targets foreigners, particularly Americans, for kidnappings and attacks. The U.S. government has long warned against all travel to Somalia, citing extremely high risks of terrorism, violent crime, and armed conflict. Even with its picturesque coastlines and rich cultural heritage, Somalia's instability overshadows any potential tourism opportunities. For Americans, entering Somalia means navigating war zones and the constant threat of danger. With no U.S. embassy in the country and minimal diplomatic representation, American travelers have little protection if they encounter trouble. In addition, Somalia's internal factions are often hostile to U.S. intervention, further heightening anti-American sentiment. While efforts to stabilize the country have been ongoing for years, Somalia remains firmly closed off to U.S. travelers, and 2024 is no exception.